This is History of Sexuality in the U.S., Lecture 4E, Part 4, talking about some of the movements that were renewed in the early 90s in this changing terrain of the straight state and globalized sexualities. Three related but importantly distinct organizations, groups, movements that really started to fire off in the early 90s are the queer, trans, and intersex movements. Queer Nation is an organization that formed out of a number of different coalitions that had been happening within AIDS activism and gay and lesbian movements. And Queer Nation sought to reject the idea of assimilation, the idea of being included and accepted as full and equal citizens just like those heterosexuals. Instead, Queer Nation said, no, we're here, we're queer, get used to it, we're in your face. They would hold kiss-ins. They attempted to out a number of prominent closeted celebrities, and they demanded a visible queer public culture, bringing that word queer that had been used for so long as a slur into the public consciousness as a reclaimed term that more and more people would embrace. Out of Queer Nation formed an offshoot group called Transgender Nation, and that organization was one of the first groups to latch on to this term transgender. For a long time, since the 1960s, the term transsexual had been used for a lot of people who were engaged in different forms of gender transition. But that medicalized term seemed to really fall into, one, the authority of doctors to talk about people's bodies, as well as some people felt it was binaristic. It suggested that male and female were these separate, immutable categories that you could cross from one to the other. Instead, we start to see people like Leslie Feinberg, Holly Boswell, and Sandy Stone talking about the transgender alternative to transsexual identity, and an idea of moving across gender categories and gender in ways that was less binaristic, that was less medicalized, and was much more political. This is going to enormously reshape a lot of people's ideas about the relationship between bodies, gender, and sexuality. Another distinct but important group doing that work that is founded in the early 90s is the Intersex Society of North America. Intersex people are people whose natural anatomy falls in between the categories of male and female. And these people had faced an enormous amount of medical violence throughout the 20th century as growing surgical techniques saw these bodies as in need of fixing. And it meant an unconsensual cutting of the body, modification of the bodies of infants, and some, and the members of ISNA would call it, infant genital mutilation. Intersex people were not politically organized as a constituency prior to the formation of this group, and many intersex people didn't even know what had been done to their bodies in their childhood. ISNA successfully politicized this issue and has put on the agenda of hospitals, of urogenital specialists, as well as obstetricians around the country and the world, the need for interventions that don't see binary gender as the only option. They've had a lot of success, but there's still a lot of work to be done on that issue. Another important movement of this moment is what is often called third wave feminism. Third wave feminism is a term that means a lot of different things to different people. Some people see it as a kind of pop cultural feminism, a feminism that was media savvy, that was engaged in new forms of communication and new ways of getting out to audiences that were skeptical of second wave feminism and many of the things that had been associated with women's liberation. At the same time, third wave feminism was also about breaking down the idea of the white middle class woman as the universal subject of feminism. And so what we see in this third wave is a really kind of a flourishing of different intersections of thinking about privilege and oppression. Women of color and transnational feminisms are going to take more and more of the space in the center of feminism and dislodge some of that assumed dominance of a certain subject. Another important movement of this time is the global justice movement, sometimes called the counter-globalization or anti-globalization movement. And they reflect these times where people are more and more attuned to globalization and the inequalities that these new connections can form. But not all movements that were growing at this time were focused on a justice-oriented agenda. And one of the most successful movements of the 1990s is the right to life anti-abortion movement. More so than almost any other movement, they've managed to have success in terms of respectable, besuited politicians who are going to pass legislation to restrict reproductive rights, as well as violent direct action. Murderers like Eric Rudolph and James Knott, who kill abortion doctors and other innocent bystanders, yet somehow don't disgrace or delegitimize the more mainstream elements of this movement. One of the major victories they won was the case Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which has led to a lot of focus on the clinics that provision this care as the focus of anti-abortion activist ire and a lot of their successful organizing. So what we want to understand is in these conditions, a lot of new movements are being renewed, but they're moving in a lot of different directions. And the exact form that any of these movements are going to move towards is still a question that's being worked out in the history that we are living in today.